So just, before we talk about any particular question, thinking about the philosophy essay. Most of the philosophy essays, if they're well-designed questions, and I hope you've come across only well-designed questions in the philosophy units you've done, and the questions in this unit are well-designed, will always invite you to take a view, to take a stance. So the first thing you should do after reading the question is to think about how are you going to answer the question? What view are you going to defend? So the first thing a philosophy question does is to invite you to take a view. You must take a view, and then the rest of the essay has to be thought of as an argument for the view. You, of course, use the materials from the study guide, from the lectures, from any other secondary readings that you're using, but all of the materials, the organizing principle has to be, I have to come up with an argument for what I want to defend, right? So here's what I suggest you do. Here's how you should start. Read the questions, make up your mind which question you're going to attempt, and once you've decided which question you're going to attempt, read the question a few times and make a list of the issues that you need to discuss. So just as an example, let me take the first question. Explain the Brahminical conception of the highest end of human life, that is moksha, with reference to theory of karma. Does it succeed? And this is the question you have to take a view on. Does it succeed in articulating a coherent and desirable conception of human values and ends? So that's what it's asking you to do, and also saying that for answering this question, you will need to pay special attention to the notion of nishkama karma. So here are the things you need to do. I said, first of all, after reading the question, make up your mind about, we're talking about the essay questions, and this is the sample exam, we'll get to this. Make up your mind about what are the things you really need to do when you're answering this question. For this particular question, you need to explain what moksha is with reference to the theory of karma. So you need to talk about the four ends of life according to the Hindus, why moksha is considered the highest end, how does the theory of karma say that you can get to the highest end. What will that bring? While you're explaining that, it will take you to nishkama karma, because we are not talking about the other paths. We are not talking about using the path of devotion or using the path of knowledge. You have to think about the path of karma, and then ask yourself, what position am I going to take? Am I going to agree with people like Chakrabarti or Framrin, who said, who do say that you can give, at least nishkama karma is coherent. We can make sense of what is being said. That's the sample exam. We're discussing the essay questions first. And the question's got another part to it. Is it desirable? Is it something you'd like, you think people should follow? Is it something you think can be defended? There are some good reasons why we should follow the path of karma. So both, whether it's coherent, whether we can make sense of doing action without desire, and then also explaining whether it is something one should desire to do as a human being. All of these things we have discussed in the lectures, but what you need to do, so after you've made a list of the issues that need to be dealt with, a rough list at this stage, go and do all the reading that you need to do. And I think after that, reconsider what view do you want to defend. So in terms of readings, you can, you do need to use the Gita if you're answering this question. So in the instructions, I do say there are 4 things. In the instructions to the essays, there are 4 things that I mention that you must achieve, or you must, take care in writing this essay. You develop a position on the relevant issues raised by the question. You demonstrate your familiarity with the primary text. So no matter which question you are doing, you must look at either the primary text from the Buddhist sources, the Gita, even if you use the Gita that is in the, reprinted in the study guide. Some of it is in Fremren's text, some of it is in Chakrabarti text. You must, make reference to the primary text, and then, of course, use the points from the study guide and the secondary readings to probe the issue further. And you have to have a well-supported argument. But make sure that you make reference to the primary text. That's a very important criteria for this essay. Also, if you want to read beyond what is in the study guide, in the readings, what has been discussed in the lectures, there are a few journals I can name where you can find good resources that you might be able to use for this essay. Let me be honest, it is not a requirement. Using primary text is a requirement. Building your argument is a requirement. Using materials other than have been discussed in the course is an added bonus, but it's not a requirement. Here's, what I mean by saying it's an added bonus. If you do make an attempt and you do find something relevant, you will get some bonus marks for it. But you won't lose marks if you don't do it, right? So the most important thing in the essay is the quality of the argument. If the quality of your argument is good, you've made a good argument and your writing is clear, that's what counts most for philosophy. Not a huge list of references, not 20 references at the end. That's not what we're looking for. So, make sure the things you're writing about, you understand them. Reading many times is more important than reading a lot. In some disciplines, reading a lot is very important. Here, understanding, critiquing, thinking about the material you're reading is more important, not, reading a lot. So quantity is not important in philosophy, quality is. So, the journals that you might like to use, there's Philosophy East and West, which is a very good journal. There is the Journal of the International Society of Buddhist Studies. Of course, if you're writing on one of the topics with the Buddhist philosophy, you might want to consider that. So there's Philosophy East and West, there's Journal of the International Studies, International Society of Buddhist Studies. There is Asian Philosophy, a journal called Asian Philosophy that you might want to use. And there is also a Journal of Indian Philosophy. So 4 journals I can recommend. You just do a search with the relevant keywords. Say if you're going to do the essay on memory, or if you're going to do the essay on Nishkama Karma, put those things in and look at the last 10 years or something, and a few relevant things will come up. Have a look and decide if you want to use any of them. As I said, it's not a requirement. Philosophy is not easy to understand, but if you decide to use it, well and good. If you think you need help understanding it, feel free to make an appointment with me. I'll be happy to go through, and clarify if you've got any questions about any text that you're reading that hasn't been discussed in the course. So the point is this: you've got to find it yourself. It's got to be independently found, and that itself is a challenge. Finding something that is relevant to the essay. If you have trouble understanding it, I'm happy to help, but as I said, it's not a requirement. You can write a perfectly good essay and get an HD even if you don't go to the, to get the extra readings. So, as I said, here's what you do. You read the questions, make a list of the issues you need to talk about, decide what position you're going to take, reconsider your position after you've read the relevant material, at least the relevant primary and secondary material from the study guide, reconsider what position you're going to take, and then start writing the essay. And always, always in a philosophy essay, write the introduction of the essay after you've written the essay, right? So what I mean by that, once you've constructed the essay, read your essay carefully and then ask yourself, what exactly have I achieved here? What have I been able to argue for? Because you might begin sometimes wanting to argue for a very strong position, but not being able to come up with an argument for that strong position. So I always recommend that write the essay first, read the essay carefully yourself, and then sort of think, what have I achieved in this essay? This is the copy of the sample exam, not the essay questions, but I'm discussing the essay questions first. It's just a revision class. There are 3 things you need to do in an introduction after you've written the essay, and I will go through one of the topics in detail in a moment. 3 things that you do need to do in an introduction for a good essay. You need to say which issues you will be discussing, and you need to say clearly what position you will be taking. You don't have to hide it as a surprise as in some other subjects. You have to be upfront about what position you will be defending in the essay. It's important to be upfront because that will, tell your marker how to read your essay. The marker knows what the end point of this essay is, so they can put things in context. They know where you're going. So you need to say right at the front, I will be arguing for, that moksha or nishkama karma is a coherent and desirable, whatever it is that you want to argue for, you put it straight in the introduction. The third thing you need to do in the introduction is say something about the structure of your essay. And that's why I really say you shouldn't write the introduction before you write the essay, because you don't have a good grasp of the introduction, of the structure before you actually get it out, before you actually write it. Even after 20 odd years of doing philosophy, when I write, I still do the introduction last. Introduction has to be gotten to last when I'm writing an essay or a paper. So make sure, don't start with writing an introduction, and don't forget not to look at it. Even if you start with writing an introduction, you need to reconsider that. So 3 things that you need to do in an introduction: tell us what issues you will be concerned with in this essay, tell us what position you will be taking, and give some clues to the structure of your essay. So say, first I will explain what moksha is in the context of karma. Then I will consider Chakrabarti, not agree with Chakrabarti. Then I will consider Fremrin and agree with Fremrin. Whatever, however you want the dialectic to go, you have to say something in the introduction straight away. Does that make sense? So 3 things you must do in the introduction, I've said. Now, which particular question would you like me to consider? We can do either 1, 2, or 3. We haven't covered quite the material for 4 as yet. That will be in the next lecture, so that's a little over a week before the essay is due. But with the last essay, question. So the first essay question is just on Hindu ethics. The second essay question is on Buddhist ethics. The third essay question is on the memory argument. And the fourth essay question is on Buddhist metaphysics, their view of, no continuing identity over time. But the fourth essay is necessarily a comparative essay, in the sense that it asks you to consider Buddhism and Parfit. So I will talk a little bit about Parfit, but one thing I will say, I'll recommend that only those people who've done first-year philosophy try the last question. Parfit is something you read in first-year philosophy if you've done Time, Self, and Mind. How many of you have done time, self, and mind? Right, so 3 of you have done. If you've done that, you must have come across Parfit. If you want to do the last question, that's fine. If any of the others are really tempted to do the other question, read the Parfit bit. It's on the extra readings on Moodle. But please come and check with me, check your understanding with me. It's not an easy piece to follow, but I'm happy to go through it. I will say something about it in class next week. My sense would be not to try this question if you haven't done the first year course. Okay, so any ideas about which of the other questions I should discuss here? There's the memory argument, which should be fresh in your mind. There's the moksha question, or there is, I think, a difficult but interesting question on Buddhist ethics. Which one would you like me to discuss? Any number 2? Any other choices? Pardon? 1 or 2. Any other views? Well, majority says 2 then, and so we'll go with 2. It's an interesting question. I think it's difficult. It's not as straightforward. If you want to do a straightforward question, 1 and 3 are very, very straightforward. Right? 2, I think, is the trickiest question, but again, you can write a very interesting essay because there's no one way of writing an essay on this question. Let me read it, and then let us first make a list of the sorts of issues you might cover if you were doing this essay. So the Buddhist ethical theory does not presuppose the existence of a spiritual, eternal soul substance, but it does presuppose a metaphysical view of the world and the individual in it. So no soul substance, but there is a world view, and we did talk about that. Explain the metaphysical presuppositions and the ethical implications of the Buddhist view, and explain whether they succeed in offering a coherent and a desirable ethical theory. So, if you were doing this question, what are the issues you need to think about? You need to think about 2 things. You need to think about what are the metaphysical presuppositions of Buddhist ethics, and what are the ethical implications. So what are the most important points in Buddhist ethics, and what metaphysical thesis does it presuppose? You need to make a list of that, and then, of course, you need to decide whether the ethical theory that the Buddhists put forward is coherent and desirable. That's what you need to take an issue on. So anyone remember what might be the metaphysical presuppositions of the Buddhist view? What did we talk about? No self is certainly one thing. That's an important presupposition, that there is no self. What else? Anything else you can remember about the? Excellent. Yep. Impermanence, very important Buddhist thesis. No self, or impermanence, or momentariness, as some people call it, very important Buddhist thesis about, the way the world is. It's a metaphysical view about what the world is like. Anything else in terms of metaphysical presuppositions? Yeah. Yeah. No transmigration of the soul. They have rebirth without transmigration. They do talk about rebirth, but they don't have transmigration of the soul. There is no soul, so there is nothing to transmigrate. 3 very important things, in the background of Buddhist ethical theory, because they do talk about rebirth. They do talk about karma. Karma is an important part of Buddhist ethical theory. The kind of life you have, the kind of form you take is dependent on previous karma. So yes, there is rebirth, but there is no transmigration. good with these three, metaphysical presuppositions in the background. So you will need to spend some time explaining each of these. What might be the ethical implications of this view? What are the ethical implications? What are the important ethical theses here that the Buddhist is talking about? There's, of course, karma. What else? Good. Yes, you do have to discuss the noble truths. The Buddhist ethical theory, what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve, is described, is captured in the Four Noble Truths. If you like, the end and the path is all in the Four Noble Truths. Like for Hindus, the end is moksha and the path is nishkama karma. For Buddhists, both the end and the path are in the Four Noble Truths. What is the end according to the Buddhist? What do you think what is the Buddhist trying to achieve? The Buddhist is trying to achieve two things. If the end of their ethical theory is two things. Let me give you a hint and see if you can figure it out. Yeah?
It's enlightenment, but enlightenment is also the removal from the cycle of rebirth.
Yep, it is enlightenment, nirvana as they call it, removal from the cycle of birth and rebirth, very similar to the Hindu theory in some sense. That's what moksha is as well, getting out of the cycle of birth and rebirth. Yes, nirvana is something that the Buddhists aim for, but nirvana is something that the Buddhists aim for at a personal level. Is there something else at an impersonal level that the Buddhists aim for? Because persons are not really important for the Buddhists. Remember, there are no persons, there are no selves. Think about the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering in the world. Suffering has a cause. Suffering can be reduced by suffering can be removed by removing the causes. The way to removing suffering is the Eightfold Path: right action, right effort, right meditation, so on and so forth. So what might be an impersonal goal that the Buddhist is trying to achieve? End suffering, or at least reduce suffering. And the most important goal, the Buddhists think impersonally for good for everyone in the universe, is to bring down the suffering. Nirvana will contribute because it will be one less individual suffering. Once you're out of the cycle of birth and rebirth, it will be one less individual suffering. But the more important, that's how I feel, or how I think, even though the Buddhists talk about nirvana a lot, but because the notion of persons or selves is not really there in the Buddhist stuff, what is really important is their impersonal goal of reducing suffering, ideally bringing an end to suffering. But what is guiding every action, what is guiding every behavior, what is guiding, everything that a Buddhist does is trying to reduce suffering, trying to reduce, mental and physical suffering in the world. Not just your own suffering. Because, your own, according to the Buddhist, me, myself, is not very well defined. Even though I might do meditation to calm my mind, you might think meditation is something I do to calm my mind becomes calmer, and I suffer less from agony and anxiety. The Buddhist is not, the boundaries between individuals are not very clear according to the Buddhists. So this notion of my suffering being reduced doesn't make very good sense. You have to be very, very careful in drawing out, what the Buddhist ethical aim is. The aim, according to the Buddhist, I think, at one level, to get nirvana is very important. To get out of the cycle of birth and rebirth is very important. But the background, the more, motivating force behind the Buddhist picture is an attempt to reduce suffering in the world, or ideally to end it impersonally, not mine or yours or anyone else's. That's what the Buddhist end is. What's the method? What does a Buddhist think is the method of getting there? What should one do? What's the cause of suffering? Try and remember back. Attachment, desire is the cause of suffering, is the root of suffering. That's what you need to get rid of to remove suffering. And, you know, a more detailed, if you like, method is spelled out in the Fourth Noble Truth. You will find they have, you know, the Eightfold Path has 8 things you might do: right effort, right action, right desire, right conduct, so on and so forth. 8 things that you might do in order to get to the Buddhist ideal. Okay? So notice a lot of, you know, no matter which question you're trying to do, a lot of time goes in thinking about, you know, what the question is asking, how do I organize this material? Philosophy is not just, you know, saying everything that is in a paper or in a text directly back. That's not what is important. What is important is how you organize the information you have. That's where structure is important. That's where structuring your argument is going to become important. Even in explaining, you know, what the end according to the Buddhist ethical theory, what is the end of human beings, or what end should we strive for, and what is the path, requires a bit of thinking about. You know, I said about the Four Noble Truths in the lecture, but I didn't say, you know, what exactly was the role played by these things. So that's, you know, what I want to emphasize. What we want to see in your essays, I wish I could say what I want to see in your essays, and I hope I will read some of them, is, you know, how you develop your view. So very important, how you are thinking. That needs to come out right in the first person. This is not psychology or any other. You have to talk about we or, you know, them. Right in the first person, I think one way to, you know, interpret this is such and such. That's what we want to hear, really, from you. So I guess we've said something about the issues we are going to cover if one was doing this topic. Now, what position shall we try to defend? Is Buddhism coherent, given the impermanence, given the no-self, given rebirth without transmigration? Does the Buddhist give you a coherent and a desirable thing? Both things have to be dealt with separately. So what will be the biggest issue for coherence? I mean, if you think back to the Nishkama Karma essay, the biggest thing for coherence is if it says action without desire. If Nishkama Karma means action without desire, that does not make sense because, you know, it is duty for the sake of duty. But why should I do duty for the sake of duty? It's because I want to get moksha. So it seems that desire is playing a role there. Now think back to the Buddhist picture. What would be the problem for coherence of the Buddhist view? Given these metaphysical presuppositions in the background, what is the biggest problem in terms of coherence for the Buddhist view? The desirability question is easy to answer. That's up to you whether you think it's desirable or not. You know, you don't have to take a view that everyone would agree with, but the issue about coherence is something that should, you know, strike everyone. So what's the problem with coherence of the Buddhist view? No self, and no self doesn't fit with what? You know, no self in itself is incoherent, or no self doesn't fit with something. I mean, one way of spelling out the no self is just saying, you know, according to the Buddhists, everything is changing, everything is impermanent. Selves are something, the way the Hindu tradition defines the self, it's an eternal, unchanging entity. According to the Buddhists, there's nothing like that. So this is, so there are no selves, they think. Now, there's nothing incoherent in what I just said. It might not be believable. That you might say, what's the argument for believing the Buddhist view? But that's not incoherent. So the no-self theory, when you say it's incoherent with what? What doesn't fit together? Nishkama karma doesn't fit together with, the nishkama bit doesn't fit together with action. Action, without desire, without having absolutely no desire, you cannot be motivated to act. That's the problem with nishkama karma. What's the problem? No self doesn't fit with what in the Buddhist theory? Where does it cause tension? Coherence is about feeling there's a tension here. What does it put stress on? Think about it. It's a useful class, getting you guys to think.
There's no self that truly is subject to experience, and who is it that actually experiences that suffering that the Buddhists talk about?
Excellent. That's a very good point. No self means there's no subject of experience, there's only desires, there's only pains, there's only all those things bundled together in physical and mental states. If that's the case, then how do we even make sense of, who is going to be reborn? Who is suffering? All those questions. If there is no who, those questions seem to be, unanswerable. Who is the one who gets reborn? If there is no individual, if it's only a collection of physical and mental states which are always changing, who gets reborn? Who has to suffer on account of their previous actions? Who has to experience the pain? Whose suffering are we trying to reduce? All those questions, you're very right, that's where the most pressure, that's where, the no self and the Buddhist view doesn't fit together. How might we answer it? If you want to defend, one way to take is say this is incoherent. We just can't make sense of it. If you want to defend it, you have to think your way around. How might we make sense of what is being talked about, even though there seems to be a tension between no self and their ethical view that, individuals are reborn. How you are reborn depends on the kinds of actions you've done in the past, but if there is no continuing subject, who's the one who's enjoying the fruits of karma? Who is the one who's suffering on account of their bad actions? There are no answers to these questions. How might a Buddhist try and say, no, there's a way of thinking about it. Think back to rebirth without transmigration. The clue is in there. That's not the whole answer, but the clue is in there. There's no continuing self, yes. But what was the analogy used in rebirth without transmigration? This is almost like an exam. Pardon? Light, yes, passing on light. There was a candle analogy, and what was the other analogy? Knowledge, yes, learning from your teacher. Nothing gets passed over. So in order to explain continuity, you're right, the answer lies in continuity, but you have to explain continuity without claiming that something continues to exist. There's a way, so their account of continuity is in terms of causal relations. Causal relations are going to do the work for the Buddhists that is done by an unchanging self for the Hindus. Instead of an unchanging self, what they have is bundles of mental and physical states joined together by causal relations. And so for Buddhists, the work of trying to explain why this picture is coherent has to be done in terms of causal relations. And so you try and tell a story about how causal relations can explain continuity over time without, saying that there is identity. It's not the same person, because according to the Buddhists, nothing remains the same over a period of time, but it is a person that is causally connected to the earlier state and has the physical and mental characteristics that it has on account of the behavior of the earlier state. So, very, very simply, if you were a heavy smoker, then the physical and mental states that you will inherit, bad lungs and, suffering anxiety because of wanting a cigarette all the time if you're a very heavy smoker. That's going to result in that kind of state. So your actions determine what kind of mental and physical states because of the causal connection between them. So if you wanted to defend the position that the Buddhist view is coherent, you have to tell a story in terms of causal relations. Causal relations explain continuity on the Buddhist view without presupposing, you might call it unity or identity over time. The Buddhist does not claim that there is identity over time. I am not the same person as the one who was here a week ago, but the reason why I'm responsible for doing what that person said, or what that thing in the past said she was going to do, is because I'm causally connected to her. So I remember. Memory is an important thing that can be explained by causal connections. I remember saying this week is going to be a revision week, and so that's exactly what I'm doing, keeping my commitments. Is the Buddhist view desirable? We've talked about coherence. I'm not going to tell you the story. You have to write up the story in terms of causal relations. Is the Buddhist view desirable? Now, this is a very sort of kind of, personal question, if you like, we're asking you. Do you think following the Buddhist path is a worthwhile thing to do? Is it something people might be motivated to do? How might you motivate someone? Are you motivated? How might you motivate your friend to follow something like the Buddhist path? How many of you think it is desirable? One person does, 2, 3, 4. Thinking, that's all right. So you think it's desirable. Try and convince me. Suppose I don't think it's desirable. What reason might you give me to tell me, no, it's not that bad, it's coherent and it's desirable? Manima, here's a reason why you should follow the Buddhist path.
Mental effect. So it's not necessarily maybe about the, reborn in the self.
Yeah.
Because you probably, unless you're, you probably won't even remember your future self. We don't know of
Past
previous
self.
selves. Yeah, but I feel like it's more. I like the idea of history.
Mm-hmm.
From what we come, it's something that our, previous generations done, and then we have a social responsibility.
Yeah. And one way of putting your point is, it's not about you.
Yeah.
According to the Buddhists, there is no you, so it's not about you. It's not just about me and mine and my friends and, the circle that I worry about the most. I mean, one of the things that makes the Buddhist picture really desirable is the sense of social responsibility that just comes naturally. And not just social responsibility, responsibility for future generations, responsibility for everyone. It's not just, that we in Australia, me and my friends, and, all of us live comfortably. I mean, in some sense, we have an obligation to everyone, that we might be causally interacting with, because, they're part of ourself in some sense, in so much as my previous state is part of myself. So is, so are my students, so are the people I'm interacting with, so are, poor children in India, so are refugees in Syria. I'm causally connected to all of them. The government I voted for, think about that connection. The government I voted for, or the government we voted for as a collective, has a role to play in world politics. That has a role to play in what's happening in Syria. It might not be what I exactly wish, but there is a causal link that can be traced. And some of the events happening remotely far from you in a different space, and again in a different time, remotely far from you. How let's say part of the decisions made by the government we vote for is going to have major consequences for the environment in Tasmania because of all the logging, because of all the decisions. Which heritage areas are being protected and which are no more being protected, going to have an effect on that environment. And we have to take responsibility. According to the Buddhists, so you don't just have responsibility for yourself in the future. You have to think about, this collective notion of how deeply interconnected, causally connected we all are. All the decisions that happen, all the things, all the actions that happen, it's not giving up in despair, but it is taking responsibility and trying to do something different. The Buddhist is not saying, oh, this is too hard. And the Buddhist is not even saying, you need to find out about all the causal relations. The causal relations are not something which are given. We don't know what exactly the causal links are and how this exactly happened, but that's not the point. The fact that there are causal links is enough for the Buddhists to take responsibility. Causal relations explain, and they say that's what explains your relationship with your future self and your past self. But that's what explains your relationship with all other selves, all other beings around you, including the environment. So that kind of an argument can be made for, telling someone why the Buddhist view is a desirable view. It teaches you it's not about you. It's not just about the selfish me, because there's no self. Selfishness or a selfish attitude doesn't quite make sense. Anything more that someone might like to add? No, that is making sense. I mean, the Buddhists, that's why the Buddhist wants to deny, it's not memory of previous lives. It's not, it's not how much you remember, it's not how much you know. Memory's also got this bit about that I actually remember. I remember my past. So the Buddhist is more talking about, that's the fact. The way we are now is because of the way we have been in the past. And that's a very intuitively plausible, my current mental and physical state is kind of determined by my previous mental and physical states. And that's all there is according to the Buddhists. So it might not be that you have a clear memory of being part of the oppressed group, as you said, but it might be that, your mental and physical states carry the causal stamp of it, so to say. So here's a way of thinking about it. It's not a very good example, but think about, how old is a tree? How do we find that out? You see the rings in the bark, right? The tree doesn't know its age, but those rings can be interpreted. So the kind of being you are, maybe you are, because of that past experience, maybe you are someone who feels a lot of empathy for oppressed people, because at some level, at some deep level, you understand what it is like to be oppressed, because you've been there. That kind of thing. So the Buddhist is not saying you have to know it. The Buddhist is saying, it is a fact that your current self is on account of what your past self is. If you've been part of the oppressed class, probably that's one reason why you tend to have more empathy than the others. So there's a little bit of a difference. They don't want to put too much weight on what you know and what you remember, but they say there's an objective fact about causal, that's how causality works in the universe, and that explains your current self, and that has the potential, or will have the potential to explain your future self. And that's why you need to do something about the present. You need to change in the present to have a better future, but not just to have a better future for yourself, but to have a better future, full stop, for everyone. For the environment, for all living beings, because all of them are causally connected with your being in some sense. Rather than your soul or yourself, the Buddhists would be better talking about your being. The fact that you are an individual is determined by all these other things. Any other points?
I think it frees us from the past and lets us focus on the present. Because since mental and physical states change all the time, what we can really experience is the mental and physical state now.
Yeah.
So I think, it's also a bit, it's quite forgiving in a way.
I think there is something to that. It's sort of focusing on the present. Past is not something you can do anything about. So it's forgiving in that sense, but not forgiving in another sense, because you have to suffer. So it's not forgiving as if the past will go away, will fall away. But yes, you have a lot of control in the present. Yeah, I agree.
I was actually thinking about it. I don't know if it's right in a way, but I was thinking about the Buddhist theory, and it kind of feels, with, for example, Christianity, is that there is a hell and then there is a heaven, and that now you live somewhere in the middle, and then you die, and then you enter it. But I feel like the Buddhist theory is like you're already in hell. You know what I mean? It's like we suffer, so they're saying, it's a daily suffering.
Yeah.
And it feels like we're already in hell, like according to Buddhists. And then now we'll have to, get to not heaven necessarily, but, achieve that state.
Better state.
Better state, yes. I just found it really interesting, and I actually do like that idea better than the ideas of Christianity, where you kind of, you live that one life,
And then it's you going to heaven, not your friends, not your family, not, people you might be. It's you that goes to heaven, it's you that go through judgment, all of that. And the Hindu picture is very similar to the Christian picture. I mean, this point, you're quite right. This is very important to the Buddhist. All existence is bound up with suffering. That's the first noble truth. All existence on this planet, while you're in this cycle of birth and rebirth, is bound up with suffering. The Hindus also buy this completely. The Hindus will also buy this view completely. And they will say, yes, you will move to a better plane. If you live a better life, you will move to a better plane, whether within this life, because your experiences might improve. If you're a better person, you will be less anxious. If you're a better person, physically you'll be healthy, blah, blah, blah. If I give up smoking, I'll be better off if I stop abusing my mind and my body, of course, my next state will be better off. But the thing to think about here is, I think, the flip side of this as well. When you're saying that the Buddhist theory is desirable, it really asks you to believe that all existence is suffering. Now, do we want to buy that? It might give you a better picture of what lies in the future, and if we make amends, we can live in a better world. If we live badly, of course, everything will get worse. If we all live badly, everything will get worse. So it's not promising a rosier future. It's not default saying it can only get better from here. It is saying, yes, if you change yourself, it can get better from here. But, we have to buy this idea. We have to buy into this idea. All existence is suffering. There's nothing, to enjoy here. Pleasure is just, it's just a temporary feeling which causes more craving, blah, blah, blah. The Hindus and the Buddhists both buy into this. So you might think that is desirable because it makes you work for a better future. Others might think it's not an accurate picture of the way the world is. It's not all suffering. So there are two, viewpoints. You might even want to say, so one of the things, I just come to you, one of the things in a philosophy essay is you have to consider in building up your opponent, in building up your argument, it is a good idea to consider the opponent's view. And this is something you might want to, defend it if you like. I'm not suggesting you have to agree that, there's something wrong with this assumption. But I think it's worth thinking about, how will you defend this? Because I think there's something to be said about it. It's not an accurate picture. Yeah.
Can you answer what extent is it desirable for is it desirable?
You can take that view that, it is desirable, but there are a few problems. There are limits to how desirable it might be. It is okay to take that point of view and, concede that some of the objections suggest that it's not all fully desirable or not completely ideal. That's fine too. But again, make that very clear. Make that very clear that that's what you're doing. You don't have to have a black and white view. That's not what I was suggesting when I was saying, take a view, but whatever view you decide to take, that must be spelled out clearly, and that view must be defended. That's why I say, don't spell out your view until you've defended it, because wanting to defend something is one thing. After 20 years of philosophy, bet you I realize I start off with a certain idea, I end up with a much weaker conclusion than I wanted to defend. And so you have to, rethink your idea. Sometimes you have to just chuck it because it's not worth defending anymore, or, someone has already done it in the literature. Sometimes you might be able to save it. But you must rethink after you've constructed your argument, what have I actually achieved? What might be the problems? So it's worth thinking about, not just what I want to defend, what might be the problems. And I will stop in a minute and we'll have a break. But one thing I just want to emphasize before I close this session on the essay, clarity is very important. Please don't use technical terms and Sanskrit and dress it up and make it look, that's not what philosophers are after. We want to hear your voice, say it as simply as, as if you really are trying to explain it to someone. I think that's what I try to do in class. I read those bits, but my energy is spent on trying to make it as clear as possible. And that's what I want back from you. Trying to make it as clear as possible what your view is and what your argument is. Dressing it up and making it look beautiful won't help. Too much Sanskrit, too many technical terms, English that I have to go and look up in the dictionary, none of that is going to help. That might work in some other units, but not in a philosophy unit. Try and be simple, try and be clear, read the things you're going to use a few times, because philosophy is difficult to understand it. Believe you me, any paper that I come and talk about here, I at least read it twice the day before. Okay, let's have a little break. And I think I've given you a sense of how to write the essay. and we'll come back and talk a bit about the sample exam and the questions and how to deal with it, so you'll be ready for the end of semester.